Good morning, second years. So this week, after having looked at cereals for the last 2 weeks, we're going to finish up with cereals and we're going to have a little focus on pastry this week. Now, this is one of my favourite things to teach actually, is pastry. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to make pastry at the minute at school, but nonetheless, we're going to do the theory behind it, and please goodness we'll get back and we'll be able to make a few dishes in the not so near future. So we're going to have a little look at pastry. Now, pastry, here I have some pictures of different pastries to show you. So there are lots of different types of pastry. So down here we have one of the most traditional types of pastry. This is a quiche Lorraine, and here we have a short crust pastry, and that is a pastry that you can use to make apple tart as well. So that may be short crust pastry as well. You can also use it to make sausage rolls, okay? Or sausage rolls can be made using a rough puff or a flaky pastry, as can apple tarts. They can be made using a rough puff or a flaky pastry. This here is a French dessert, a millefeuille, and this is flaky pastry, or it can be rough puff pastry, okay? So it's layers of white pastry there, and then in between each layer you have strawberries and cream. So that can be made using a puff, a rough puff, or a flaky, okay? So that's more than likely a rough puff pastry. Here we also have a puff or a rough puff or a flaky pastry in the form of vol au vents. So a lot of these pastries are intertwined. You can actually use different pastries to make different things. So you can make sausage rolls using the normal short crust pastry, which is the regular pastry, or you can make sausage rolls using a rough puff or a flaky pastry if you want a more flaky pastry outcome. Okay, here we have a spring roll, and spring rolls are made using what's called phyllo pastry. Okay, just phyllo pastry. And samosas, which are little triangular Indian snacks, are made using phyllo pastry as well. Okay, and then here we have cheese pastry, used to make cheese straws. Okay, so they're just some ideas. So what is pastry? Well, basically, it's a mixture of flour, fat, and water. Flour, fat, and water. That's basically what it is. And we generally use plain flour to make pastry. So, if it's a thing a recipe says for making sausage rolls or for making apple tart or something, you need 200 grams of regular short crust pastry. That's the most regular pastry that you can make. That means 200 grams of flour, and then it's generally half the fat, 100 grams of fat, and then water. Okay, so if it's 200 grams of short crust pastry, it means 200 grams of flour, plain flour, 100 grams of fat, and water. If it's 400 grams of short crust pastry in the recipe, it means 400 grams of plain flour and half the fat, which is 200 grams of fat, and then the water. So it may be enriched by the addition of other ingredients. So sometimes if you want to make a rich short crust, you'll add sugar or eggs or extra fat. This is needed to make a dough, and then it's shaped, so into a circular shape to make an apple tart. And it's baked in a hot oven, and it can be used in sweet or savoury dishes. So savoury is something that's not sweet. So let's look at the classification here. So short crust pastry is your regular pastry, okay? And I'm just going to write in there, half the fat to flour. Half fat to flour. Okay, so that's your recipe rule, half the amount of fat to flour. And dishes made using this type of pastry would be apple tart, quiche Lorraine, and sausage rolls. Now, instead of using plain white flour, you can use wholemeal flour to make a wholemeal or a higher fibre pastry. Savoury dishes such as high fibre quiche and pies. Okay, now you probably wouldn't use wholemeal pastry to make something sweet, okay, like a lemon meringue pie, because it would defeat the purpose. Cheese pastry then is used to make cheese straws or quiche, because quiche has cheese in it. Now, rich short crust, so that would have an egg in it or an egg and sugar, and that's used to make mince pies and flans and sweet tarts. Rough puff pastry or puff or flaky, they're all very similar, is used to make sausage rolls again. Cream pastries such as cream slices and a millefeuille, and vol au vents, there they are there, and pies. So sometimes a steak and kidney pie would be made using a flaky or rough puff pastry. Choux pastry then, this is made on the hob, so it's a hot pastry. Okay, so I'll just write it in there, made on the hob. And it's used to make eclairs or profiteroles. So there's your profiteroles there. Suet crust pastry is used to make steamed puddings. There we have it there. And phyllo pastry is used to make your spring rolls, your samosas, or your baklava, which is a Greek dessert. Okay. Now there's your cream slices and your millefeuille. So they're all rough puff pastries. Okay. So there's some of the pastries there. So you have sausage rolls, so that's probably a short crust. It doesn't look like a rough puff. There we'd have a rough puff pastry, okay, more short crust. Spring rolls, that's phyllo pastry. Quiche Lorraine, that's usually short crust or cheese pastry. Vol au vents, that could be a rough puff pastry or a flaky pastry. We have apple tart, okay, we have eclairs and profiteroles. They're your choux pastry. There's your suet crust pastry there and your steamed pudding. Okay, this here is baking blind, so you'll see what that is later on. Okay, baking a pastry case without a filling. Sometimes when we put the filling into the pastry and put it all in the oven together, the pastry can be a bit soggy. So when you bake something blind, you're baking the pastry case without the filling, and that's just to give it a chance to cook first. Then you put the filling in and put it back in the oven to cook. Okay, so can you name the type of pastry used in each image? So here we have mince pies, spring rolls, cheese straws, vol au vents, a profiterole tower, profiteroles, sausage rolls, quiche Lorraine, and a pie. Okay, so you can have a go at those. Now, the steps involved in making short crust pastry, and again, I'm going to write in here half the quantity of fat to flour. Half the fat to flour. Okay, so that's very important. Okay, so that's your little recipe rule, half the fat to flour. Okay, so the fat is rubbed into the flour using your fingertips until you get fine breadcrumbs. So it's the rub-in method. Liquid is added very slowly, usually water, and then it's kneaded to make a stiff dough, not a soft elastic one, and it's left to rest in the fridge. So it's very, very simple. Okay, and that can be used to make, for example, okay, I'm just going to write it here, this can be used to make sausage rolls. It can be used to make quiche Lorraine. It can be used to make apple tart. Okay? Right? So that's some of the things that it can be used to make. Right? So that's to give you an idea, and that's just a short crust, simple short crust pastry. Okay? Now, we have to take some guidelines into account when we are making a pastry. I'm just going to highlight short crust because it's a very important word. Okay, short crust pastry. So the guidelines for making pastry. So we have 10 guidelines for making pastry. So these are very important, and as I said before, if a recipe says 200 grams of short crust pastry, that means 200 grams of flour, plain flour, and it's half the amount of fat. So it'll be 200 grams of flour, 100 grams of margarine or butter. Okay, so weigh ingredients accurately. Okay, so always use a weighing scales, never guess the amounts. Keep ingredients and utensils as cool as possible. So you will use a stainless steel knife. You will put your water in the fridge until you need it. you will make sure that you're using not a plastic bowl but a glass bowl or a Pyrex bowl if you can. Add the water carefully. So just enough to bind it into a stiff dough, not a sticky dough. Mix it with a knife, so that's a stainless steel knife, not a wooden spoon because it's too warm. And avoid overhandling and roll as lightly and as little as possible. Now, avoid stretching the pastry as it will shrink during baking. So wrinkle rather than stretch. If you pull the pastry to make your apple tart, it's going to shrink back in the oven. So you need to make sure that you roll it out with your rolling pin to whatever the desired size is, and then you allow it to do its baking. It'll shrink back, but that's why we leave it to rest in the fridge, number 8, before we bake, to allow for that relaxation. Bake in a hot oven, okay, and the starch grains in the flour burst and absorb the fat. That's called gelatinization, and then reduce the heat. Now, well-made pastry should be light golden, not greasy, soggy or brittle. It should be fully cooked with a crisp texture, and it should have a good flavour. Now, just 2 key words associated now with pastry making. So the first one is glazing. So what does it mean to glaze? Well, this is to add a shine to baked foods. And this is one of the first things you would have learned back in first year last year, when we were making scones. And it's when you add the egg and or milk and you brush it onto the food, and in the heat of the oven the protein in the egg or milk coagulates, causing a shine. If you don't put the food in the oven, it will not shine. So you must have heat. And the last one here is baking blind. So this is what I said to you earlier. You bake the pastry case without the filling. So for example, in a quiche, or if you're making a lemon meringue pie, you may bake the pastry case first to cook it through. Then you take it out of the oven after the 15 minutes and you will put your filling in, and then you will put it back into the oven to cook. So you prick the base with a fork, then you put greaseproof paper in and a weight like dried beans or rice to prevent the pastry from rising. If you don't prick it with a fork, steam will get onto the pastry and lift it up into a bubble. Then the case is baked for 15 minutes, it's removed, and then it's put in for the further length of time to bake the filling. Okay, and then at the end I just have a couple of little revision questions for you in terms of pastry. To classify it, give examples. So watch the keywords there. Classify pastry, putting it into groups. Give examples of pastry, rules for pastry, and baking blind. So I hope you find this helpful and it'll help you with your learning stuff. And please refer to your textbook for extra information as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.